Well, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
We want to get going here because what I want to do is finish our talk from last week. We got almost all the way through it. And then continue on with what we have for today. So last week, if you have your notes with you from last week, we were looking at the composition of the Old Testament. And we were seeing that the Old Testament text that we have today is a very, very accurate reflection of what was originally written. We don't have the original manuscripts any longer for any Old Testament book. But that was the Old Testament where we have an extremely high degree of confidence that what we have reflects precisely what was originally written. For the New Testament, we have the same situation. We have no original manuscripts. We do not have the scroll that the Apostle Paul actually wrote on, or the disciple John. We just don't, those don't exist. What we have are not just copies, but they're actually copies of copies of copies. Yes, Chris, you have a question?
I thought there was one of the, a couple of sentences of John's Gospel, which is there in UK. It was found in Africa, and then...
Yes. You're referring to what's called the John Rylands fragment, but that is not an original writing. It dates, it's probably the oldest undisputed fragment. Dates to around the year 117, 120, something like that. So that's a very, very old fragment that we have. But there are no originals. So fortunately, we have a very, very reliable Greek text. We can be equally certain of the New Testament as well as the Old Testament in terms of reflecting the original. And here's why. And if you have your notes, over 6,000 ancient Greek manuscripts have been discovered. 6,000. That's a pretty big number, especially when you compare it to other secular documents that we have. But because we have so many, because we have 6,000 ancient Greek manuscripts, it allows us to cross-compare them with one another. And that allows us to very easily see where maybe there were copyist errors or changes that had been made. For example, if I have writing ABC in one text, and in another text I have AB0, because a C kind of looks like a 0 if you close it. Which one is right? Well, I might have 500 that say ABC, and I might have 12 that say AB0. And that tells me that more than likely what's happened is that the copyist made a mistake, and the few that copied his have that error in it. But the vast majority who didn't use him don't have that error. So that sort of helps us see pretty obviously where the errors are, and allows us to really come up with the original text. This is a very complicated process, and I'm oversimplifying it. But that gives you the idea of what they do. The New Testament also has earlier manuscripts than any other work of antiquity that we've found. For example, we have, Chris was mentioning a fragment that dates all the way back to the early 1st century, which would have been just, historically speaking, a very short time after the original had been written. It's the Gospel of John, and if John wrote his Gospel in around the year 90, and we have a fragment that dates to around the year 120, that's 30 years. That's a very, very short time span. Usually with documents of antiquity, for example, when we find writings from Julius Caesar or Roman historians, there's about a 1,000-year gap from the time that they actually wrote to our best copy, to our earliest copy. So there's 1,000 years of copying that we just don't have. And that's typical. No one gets upset about that. That's just the way it is. But with the New Testament, we have manuscripts and fragments that go back to within 25 to 30 years of the original. So it's a marvelous situation that really allows us to determine what the original said. Part of the nice thing about having such early copies is that it doesn't really allow time for legends or myths to develop in the text. Lots of times over the course of hundreds and hundreds of years you can have changes and, oh gee, I think if I add this, it really helps the story. There's none of that because the writings are so close to the events themselves. So all of this gives us a tremendous amount of confidence. It's been estimated that our New Testament reflects the original to a 99.5 to a 99.9% accuracy. And let me repeat that. We can be 99.5 to 99.9% sure of the original text. There's still a little room for error, because sometimes we have a situation where many manuscripts have a name spelled a certain way, and about half the other ones have a name spelled a different way. And so it's kind of a toss-up, we're not sure. But that occurs with spellings of names, spellings of cities, totally unimportant details. Nothing reflects any important doctrine or anything like that. So and in your notes, these are misspellings of names, minor grammatical differences, and those kinds of things.
What page are we on?
This is the page 4 of last week's notes, of your part 1. I'm just finishing up because last week we didn't quite get to all of that. So what we've done then last week and for a few minutes here this morning is we have looked at what the Bible is. But today I want to address 2 different questions, and this would be part 2 of your notes, if everybody's grabbed one as they've come in. Part 2 of your notes. 2 questions I want to address today. Yes, Laura.
How do you spell misspellings? Is it impressive?
I would be, yes, I believe it would be. But you're asking the absolute wrong person. I'm the worst speller in the world. You had me fooled all these years. I thought you were such a good speller. So the question is, that we want to address today, 2 questions. The first one is, how do we know that the events described in the Bible actually happened? And the second question is, how do we know the Bible really comes from God? Answering these questions, I believe, will strengthen your faith and will help you in sharing your faith with unbelievers. So the first question is, how do we know that the events described in the Bible actually happened? We demonstrated, and certainly the Bible claims to be true, right? But that doesn't mean that it necessarily was so. If it really is true, what's the evidence? What sort of reason can we have to really put our faith in the Bible? And as we walk through the evidence, I think you're going to find there's a tremendous amount of information and evidence that point to the truth, that what the writers were writing actually happened. Because they wrote some pretty fantastic things, you have to admit, when it comes to miracles and things like that. But the first thing I want to note is that the New Testament writers, those who wrote the New Testament, were either eyewitnesses of what they wrote, or they interviewed those who were eyewitnesses. And that's a very, very important thing because, most historians were not eyewitnesses to what they're writing about. Most historians are going on information that is third, fourth, fifth, sixth-hand information, and certainly could have been changed or modified along the way. When you're an eyewitness to an event, and then you write down what you saw, it's accurate, okay, because you are literally writing down what you perceived with your eyes. And that's the case with the New Testament writers. They either saw these things or they talked directly to those who knew, the disciples of Jesus themselves. Secondly, the New Testament was written within the lifetimes of those who are hostile to the faith. The New Testament was written early enough so that those who are hostile to the faith could refute biblical claims if they were untrue. You remember when Christianity started, it wasn't the most popular movement in town, was it? No, the Romans were upset with them. The Jews, look what Paul did before he became Paul. He was Saul. He persecuted the Christians. The Christians were not popular. There were lots of people who would just love to refute the story. And these books, early books of the New Testament were written and being circulated. And certainly, if what they were writing were untrue, would have easily been refuted by other people who were there. A number of the New Testament books were written within, as I say, 25 to 30 years of Jesus, not allowing enough time for legends or myths to develop or for the facts to be changed. This is a very important piece of information. Mark and Luke were written very, very early. 1 Corinthians was written early. All within the lifetimes of people who were alive when these events transpired and could easily have written a different story to correct the Gospels. But nothing, literally nothing, has ever been found that is accusing the Gospels of not telling the truth and trying to correct it. Yes, Laura?
Are you familiar with anything, other countries that have myths told or legends told, and they seem to reflect the Bible? They seem to reflect the account of
other stories that have circulated, and the problem, these things are very, very old, and it's very difficult to determine which came from which.
Right.
My belief is that the Bible is the oldest text and reflects the oldest original story, and so anything would be modifications from that. But we have the eyewitness testimony, which is very important in terms of giving us confidence. But what really strikes me as being very, very powerful is what's called sometimes the principle of embarrassment. The principle of embarrassment. And we can explain it this way. If writers include details that are embarrassing to themselves, then what they are writing is probably true. Because if you're writing a story, a true story, because the Gospels are what? They're actually biographies of Jesus. So if you're part of the story, and so you're writing about yourself, do you think you're going to make yourself look good, or are you going to make yourself look like kind of a dunderhead? Unlikely, right? We humans, just our humanity, we tend to make ourselves look good. I mean, that would be only natural. But what we find in the New Testament, as your next item says, that the New Testament writers depict themselves not in the brightest light all the time. They depict themselves as slow to learn. In fact, in that reference that I have, Matthew 15:16, Jesus tells them a parable, and they say, Jesus, we don't know what you're talking about. You know what Jesus says? Are you so dull? Are you so dull? Don't you get it? And they're writing this about themselves. They're cowardly. One betrays Jesus, one of his close followers. One of his followers denies Jesus. Even his own family doubts him. That's not the way you want to portray yourself or those who are following Jesus if you're making up a story about your leader. It's just not the way that we would write. You tend not to embarrass yourself. Now, what would explain that? It actually happened. See, that's the reason that they wrote it down that way. That's the reason they portrayed themselves that way, because that is exactly what happened. And they're interested in conveying to us the truth of what happened. And I think that is by far the best explanation for why they all depict themselves in oftentimes the less attractive light. But if you are the disciples, and let's just say for a minute that the skeptics of Christianity are right, and Jesus died and stayed dead, and so Christianity is really a fake, and now the disciples are in a fix because they look really stupid having followed this guy, and so they decide to write these Gospels to keep the story alive. This is what a lot of liberal Christians will teach today. It's surprising how many people carry the name Christian and will teach a version of the faith this way. They're just making it up. They were embarrassed. They wanted to keep the story going. If that's your goal, to keep the story going, what you're going to do, and you want to attract people to this movement, you're going to want to make it as easy as possible for people to come and join up. But what we find are these very difficult teachings and facts that are hard to accept that would make people not want to be Christians. For example, Jesus taught us and his followers to turn the other cheek if someone offends you. Now, that is not the inclination of any of us by nature, right? When someone offends us, I think in our humanity, we want to get back at them. I mean, that's our fallen nature, right? So if you got a club and you want people to join, say, oh, by the way, if somebody offends you, you just got to turn the other cheek. You just got to take it. People are going to begin to second guess that. How about loving one's enemies? I know I'm just dying to do that before I was a Christian. Yeah, sign me up for that. I want to love my enemies.
With a baseball bat.
Yeah, you see what I'm saying? I mean, they're recording these teachings of Jesus, which make no sense if it's not true. How about a call to a holy life? You think people are in line to live like that? A holy and pure, where even anger and lustful thinking are sins to be avoided. Even the way you think is wrong. You have to be careful. I mean, if you're trying to bring people into your club, these are not the criteria that you want to be setting for people to come and join. And how about this one? Their leader claimed to be God. Today, when people claim to be God, what's your first reaction?
You're right.
Yeah, right. The loony bin. This person is clearly off the rocker. And yet, This is the story. You're going to join our movement? You have to believe that our leader was God, the one and only. Not only was he God, but think about it. Even if you accept the fact that he was God, well, when he comes to earth, he's got to be a king then. He's got to be the most richest. He's got to have the most luxurious life. This is God, right? What happens to him? He dies a shameful criminal's death on the cross. Shameful death. People say, well, God would never let himself be treated like that. That's ridiculous. You know, so if this is the kind of story you're telling, the only explanation for it is that it was true. They're writing what he actually taught and claimed. Their leader performs miracles. Miracles, now, they're always hard to swallow, right? Someone does a miracle today, I'm always very skeptical, I guarantee you. My mind is just, I need to be sure about it. But the greatest miracle is that he rose from the dead. If you want to be a Christian, you have to believe that someone actually rose from the dead. That's a very rare thing. So, these difficult facts and difficult teachings, I think, are a clue to the fact that the writers are writing exactly what happened. They're not interested in what people think about it or how they're going to judge it or evaluate it. They're saying, look, here's what happened. This is what I saw and what he taught. There are other difficult facts as well. The gospel stories include many prominent and historically confirmed persons, which they could not have gotten away with writing lies about. These were famous people. People like Pilate, who was places of power and authority, Caiaphas, Festus, Felix, Herod, kings and governors. You're writing stories that these people had certain conversations. When they have conversations, there's lots of witnesses. They don't have these conversations in private. And so if you're writing that all these things transpired, they can easily be verified or refuted. Got to be true. And how about this one? A member of the body that crucified Jesus, the Sanhedrin determined that Jesus was guilty and worthy of death. But one of those very people honored Jesus by buying a grave for him and burying him. That doesn't make sense. Yeah? Why throw that detail in to complicate things if the story's not true? Right? But it's true. That's why they say it. And why have women who were not even permitted to testify in court in those days be the first to see the empty tomb and the risen Christ? Thank goodness we've come a long way. But in the first century, Middle Eastern culture, this is just the way it was. Women were not looked upon in a very favorable light at all. In some places in the Middle East, it's still like that. Thelma, you could probably testify to that. It's still like that, and even worse, I suspect, in the first century. So if you have women who were not considered credible witnesses at all, be the very first ones to see the risen Jesus, why put that in the story? You're not helping your cause. The reason why it's in there is because that's what actually happened. This is evidence that what the writers were writing was actually true. And the final one, kind of the icing on the cake really, is why would 11 of the 12 disciples die for their belief in the resurrection if they had made up the story of Jesus? We know from, not from the Bible, but from sources outside the Bible, we learn that 11 of the 12 disciples were martyred for their faith. They died because they believed and would not come off the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. Now let me tell you something. If you are lying, you're telling a lie, you're making something up, and someone puts the spear to your throat and says you either tell the truth or this is your last moment on earth, you're going to come clean. None of them did. All 11. Now there was one. What about the other one? Well, that was John. He was exiled to an island. He never had the chance to. He didn't get off that island until he was really old. And by that time, they didn't care about him. But all the other 11 who went out and who were busy defending the faith and sharing the news about the resurrection all died because of that faith. And that tells me that they believed it. Because when it comes down to your life, it would be so easy. In fact, a lot of people, even if they believe it's true, would say, okay, don't kill me, I recant. But no, they stayed true to what they believed, even in the face of death. Very, very powerful evidence that they believed the story to be true. Yes?
And it's either at the end of Acts 5 or Acts 6, or maybe Acts 4. How about maybe the other difficult fact would be that they mentioned other people who claimed to be the Messiah and kind of died out, right? So like, would that work as evidence that the Bible is 100% true? 'Cause,
Probably so.
Why else would you mention it if they?
Exactly.
You know, it seems like it would cast doubt into people.
Exactly. The fact that there are many other kinds of things like that that we could include here. So the fact that they're mentioning things that could cast doubt on the story really go to the fact that what they're writing is true. You judge for yourself. All they're interested in is giving you the truth, without being concerned of what it looks like. Today we're so concerned what people are going to think about it. What is it going to look like? They didn't care. They're just writing down what happened. Yes, Steve.
No, I believe it's in Acts or something. It said that there were 500 witnesses, and these people are still here.
Yes.
So, like, when the book was written, it's saying that you can go. It wasn't like, remember what Paul said when he was talking, I think, to Festus? He said this wasn't done in a corner.
Yeah.
It wasn't just like 12 people in a room and they saw Jesus and he left. It was
Yes.
500 people that they said you can go and talk to
You're
that
re-
saw this.
You're referring to 1 Corinthians 15,
1 Corinthians, okay.
where Paul says, basically, to paraphrase Paul, he says, by the time Paul's writing, it's probably 20 years after the resurrection of Jesus, 20 years after he was crucified. And Paul says, there's still over 500 people alive today who saw the risen Christ, who saw him after he died. You don't believe me? Go talk to them. They'll tell you. They saw him. Now, you wouldn't say that. You wouldn't put your whole ministry and credibility on the line if that. It just takes one person to check him out, one person to follow up to ruin his entire thing. He'd never say that if it wasn't the case. So yeah, very powerful evidence that what they were writing was true. But there's also, I think is fascinating, is how archaeology has helped corroborate and confirm things that are said in the Bible. Archaeology is a very powerful historical way of gaining knowledge. And thankfully we have lots and lots of archaeologists around, and they have done a lot of work. And there have actually been, in the Middle Eastern area, there have been hundreds of archaeological finds, what they call finds or discoveries, which support statements that are made in the Bible. Hundreds of them. No archaeological discovery has ever been made that refuted a biblical statement. This is amazing. Everything that archaeology digs up turns out to be in support of something that was said in the Bible. Now, your next point. While archaeology does not prove the authority of the Bible, it does confirm the accuracy of it. Okay? So archaeology, just because we dig up things that have people's names and stuff written on it, that doesn't prove that the Bible is, authoritative for us. But it does confirm the accuracy of the writers, and I think confirms their credibility as well. The writers don't know what's going to be dug up thousands of years later, right? They don't know. But the stuff that we've dug up confirms everything that they've said. In the Old Testament, for example, the Old Testament contains names of at least 26 foreign kings which appear on monuments or other documents from the time of their reign. Likewise, many kings of Judah and Israel have been found on Assyrian documents with the identical spelling as our modern text. It's very interesting because in Old Testament times, of course, you had a king who goes out and he defeats another land or another king. They like to write about it. Here's who I defeated. And so we've discovered their writings. And they have the names of the Israelite kings, exact same spellings, no doubt of who they're talking about, which again acts as a tremendous confirmation to the accuracy of the information. And in the New Testament, first century inscriptions have been found. We don't have the projector here when I teach this. In college, for example, I have lots of cool slides which show you these pictures. But they found inscriptions of Pontius Pilate's name, the name of Caiaphas, the high priest. These important people that are mentioned, they found actually inscriptions to know that these are true historical people. Absolutely confirmed. And archaeologists today confirm that Luke, who was a really good historian, he named 54 countries in his writing. Now remember, he wrote the book of Luke and the book of Acts. So in that whole work, he names 54 countries, 32 cities, and 9 islands, and hundreds of other details, geographical details, without making a single error. He was there. See, that's what it tells you. He was there. He's not relying on other people telling him stuff. He's writing what he saw, what he knew. very, very sharp when it comes to the details. On page 3, I've got a couple of quotations. Let me look at the second one first, by Sir William Ramsay. Ramsay is regarded as one of the greatest archaeologists to have ever lived, and he wrote this about Luke. He said, "Luke is a historian of the first rank. Not merely are his statements of fact trustworthy, this author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians." This guy, he's not looking at this from a Christian standpoint. He's looking at Luke as a historian of gaining information about the past that's accurate, and says he's one of the best. He's one of the best. The top quote, according to noted archaeologist William F. Albright, in his book, The Archaeology of Palestine, he writes, "Discovery after discovery has established the accuracy of innumerable details and has brought increased recognition to the value of the Bible as a source of history." So these guys are writing, saying, look, just from a secular standpoint, they're accurate. They're absolutely accurate, and so it becomes valuable to us to learn about the past. That's how trustworthy their words are. Fantastic.
Who was Theophilus, the person that Luke was writing to?
I'm not sure. Anybody know? No, apparently somebody who was in power and authority. I don't think we know a whole lot about him. At least I certainly don't. But that's a great question to research. But that Stephen's asking, who is Theophilus? Who is the person who Luke has addressed his gospel to? "I am writing to you, Theophilus, to clarify and to set the story straight." And I'm not exactly sure who that is in history.
Phil is thinking like, okay, he saw a lot of things, but when you're trying to write something and trying to give substance to someone to prove something that happened, you can't just say, I saw this, so believe it because I saw it. Like when you read Luke's writing, he has a lot of substantiation
Absolutely.
of people that he talked to, like maybe Mary, the mother of Jesus, this one, that one. And
Yep.
that gives a lot of credibility because he talked to a lot of people as well.
Exactly, and he says that's his plan. That's what he's trying to do, to get all the facts together from everybody who knows. And but I think here's something interesting, and this comes up quite often. Sometimes I hear people say, well, that's all fine. Jesus. They talk about Jesus in the Bible, but he's never mentioned outside the Bible. Isn't that odd that he's never mentioned outside the Bible? Well, people like that don't really know their history. Let me clarify a couple things for you. Here's number one question. How many, now let's talk about non-Christian sources that we have discovered, that we've dug up. How many non-Christian sources mention Jesus within the first 150 years of his life? So we're looking at a very short time span historically. From the time that he lived in early first century to around the mid to late 30s to maybe the year 180. That time frame so people have time to write about him. How many times is he mentioned in non-Christian sources? The answer is 10. Okay? We have 10 times where he is mentioned by non-Christians within that very short time frame. Now that, I don't know whether 10 seems like a big number to you or not, but let's put it in perspective with the next question. How many non-Christian sources mention Tiberius Caesar, who was the emperor at the time of Jesus, a Roman Empire, largest empire in the known world at that time? How many mention him in that same 150-year period? Answer, 9. 9.
Without Facebook.
What's that? Without
Without
Facebook.
Facebook.
Yeah, so
Sorry.
I say this because you think of Tiberius Caesar, probably the most famous guy in the world at his time. All right? Of all that we've dug up, we have 9 times that he's actually mentioned by non-Christians. Luke mentions him one time, not counting that he's a Christian. Non-Christians, 9. So that kind of puts it a little bit in perspective. We get a lot of information from these non-Christian sources. And what I've done is I've included 3 examples of them, just so that you can have them for reference. It's very interesting. The first one that I have on here is by the 1st century Roman historian Cornelius Tacitus. Okay? Very important writer. He lived from about the year 55 to the year 120, so you can see he was not long after Jesus himself lived. But Tacitus was a historian, and here's a quote from him. He mentions those called Christians by the populace, Christus, with the Latin form of Christ, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So here's a non-Christian historian telling us what happened to Jesus. Very, very interesting. The Jewish historian, Flavius Josephus, completed his book of antiquities in the year 93. So this would have been written shortly before the year 93. But he said this: "There was a wise man called Jesus. His conduct was good and he was known to be virtuous. Many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to die." So again, a confirmation from someone who's not a Christian as to what was actually happening back then. And then I have the Roman historian Suetonius, who was the chief secretary to Emperor Hadrian. Hadrian was the Roman emperor from the year 117 to the year 138. And so Suetonius, what he did was he decided to write a history on the previous emperors. And so in his section on the Emperor Claudius, he writes this: "Because the Jews at Rome caused continuous disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus," again another Latin spelling of Christ, "he expelled them from the city." And what's really cool is that this seems to be confirmed by Acts 18 verse 2. Take a look, I wrote it here for you. Here's what Acts 18:2 says. "There he met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome." So here you have a Roman historian talking about something happened, and then the Bible referring to the exact same event. Yeah,
Is there any place where we can get the remaining 7?
you can, and that's on the next page. Trying to anticipate that question. But you'll see it's at the end of these 12 statements, the documentation. But let's look at all 10 of these sources for a moment. The 10 non-Christian sources that mention Jesus in that short time frame. Here's the information we get from those quotations. Jesus lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar. He lived a virtuous life, and he was a wonder worker, a worker of miracles. He had a brother named James. He was acclaimed to be the Messiah. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He was crucified on the eve of the Jewish Passover. Darkness and an earthquake occurred when he died. His disciples believed that he rose from the dead. His disciples were willing to die for their belief. Christianity spread rapidly as far as Rome, and his disciples denied the Roman gods and worshiped Jesus as God. All from non-Christian sources. You basically have the gospel in a nutshell, thank you, to non-Christians. Isn't that amazing? Now, the question came with documentation. You can find these documented in 2 books. One is I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek on pages 222 to 223. And then an even more detailed, I believe, Gary Habermas. Gary Habermas is one of the world's leading authorities on the historicity of Jesus. And in his book, The Historical Jesus, he devotes an entire chapter to all of these quotes. This is not a book that's easy to read and is not designed for popular reading. Graduate schools use this book as a textbook. I had, when I was writing my dissertation, Dr. Geisler told me that I better quote him or I'd be in trouble. So I have the book at home. But Dr. Habermas quotes all of those in detail. Absolute fascinating confirmation of the truth of the Bible. I think when you look at the evidence as a whole, when you put it all together, there just can be no question. I mean, honestly, anybody who's objectively wants to know the truth, you must find this compelling. You can't explain all of this evidence away and say, well, no, it's just all coincidence or, it just doesn't make sense. The fact that the writers were writing the truth is the only thing that explains all of this evidence. But there's still another question left outstanding. And that would be the question, how do we know that the Bible really does come from God? The Bible claims to be from God. As we talked about last week, that the Bible is breathed out by God. But how do we know it's true? How do we know the Bible really comes from God? Is there any evidence? Just because the Bible is true doesn't mean it necessarily comes from God. My son's algebra textbook is true. It doesn't necessarily come directly from God to us, okay? So just because it's true doesn't necessarily mean it's from God. If it comes from God, it is true. But how do we know that it comes from God? Here's how I think. It's just, in my mind, again, I'm just trying to give you, there's so much more I could give you. I'm giving you what impresses me. and what I just have found really, really compelling. And this I find compelling. I preached on this a number of years ago. Some of you may recall this. But I have 10 statements written down, and if you were to take these 10 statements and go to anybody in your town of Piscataway or Edison or wherever you live, Christian or non-Christian, as long as if they've grown up in this country, if you grew up in another country, this might not hold. But if you've grown up in the United States and you read these 10 statements and you ask that person, to whom do these statements refer? I believe every person will answer correctly, Christian or non-Christian. Let me read to you these 10 statements. He was oppressed and afflicted. He did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. They divide my garments among them and cast lots for my clothing. They have pierced my hands and feet. He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities, and by his wounds we are healed. Despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. See, your king comes to you righteous and having salvation, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. Even my close friend whom I trusted, who shared my bread, has lifted his heel against me. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened and the ears of the deaf unstopped. The lame will leap like a deer and the mute tongue shout for joy. I've offered my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I did not hide my face from mocking and spitting. And finally, my God, why have you forsaken me? To whom do those statements refer? Are you sure?
Yes.
Are you positive?
Yes.
I agree with you. And I think that if you ask anybody who's grown up in the United States that same question, they will answer you the same way. You can't explain. These don't appear to, refer to any other historical person that we know of. Jesus is the only one that fits. And how can you be so sure? Because of the detail. There's so many details based on what we know of the life of Jesus that these have to refer to him. The answer is Jesus. But the problem that the skeptic has to answer, and that your non-Christian friend, if he says that these talk about Jesus, the question he would have to answer is, how is it that these describe so much detail about Jesus when they were all written more than 400 years before Jesus lived? Because all of these come from the Old Testament. All of this detail. If you turn to the next page, you will have the documentation where each one of these statements comes from. The Old Testament indisputably completed at least 400 years before Jesus has lived. Now, if I wanted to write a prediction today, I might predict that Iran is going to have a nuclear bomb. North Korea is going to try to start a nuclear war. I could write that prediction weeks or months ahead of time, and maybe it comes true. But there's no way that I could possibly write a detailed prediction of Korea that's going to happen 400 or 500 years from now. How could I possibly have that kind of information? I could take a lucky guess on the short term, but 400 years? Nobody could possibly have the kind of detail about the life of Jesus so long before he lived, unless the Bible is from God. No other explanation other than that the Bible is really from God. Now, the other thing is it's not just predictions about Jesus in the Old Testament. There are many other predictions, but let me give you some more about Jesus. I was reading recently where I believe that the Jewish scholars have identified more than 400 Old Testament predictions that were fulfilled in the life of Jesus. I forget the exact number. I think it's 454 or 52. I can't remember. But it's over 400 that they believe were messianic prophecies. The Jews, okay? And when you look at some of these other predictions, it's amazing. Again, the amount of detail that's there is just stunning. For example, the exact town where the Messiah would be born. Bethlehem is prophesied in Micah 5, verse 2. That's pretty specific for 400 years ahead of time. The exact tiny village really is all it was where Jesus would be born. that he would be born, that God is going to be born as a human child. Isaiah 9:6. And that this Messiah would minister in the region of Galilee. I don't know what Galilee looked like when Isaiah wrote that, man, but probably nobody lived there. You know. The exact lineage of the Messiah, his tribe, and which family within that tribe that he would be born from. That's pretty hard to predict hundreds of years ahead of time. That he would be pierced through, we find in Isaiah and Zechariah. That he would be given sour wine to drink. And that was true when he was hanging on the cross. That he would be buried in a grave for the rich. And what's amazing, the exact price of his betrayal, which turned out to be 30 pieces of silver, which is recorded in Zechariah 11. By the way, there's a typo. That should be Zechariah 11, verse 12. I'm sorry that there's a dash instead of a colon. But that's Zechariah 11, verse 12. That mentions the 30 pieces of silver. And then, of course, that is relayed to us by Matthew in Matthew 27, when he explains what Judas did and how much Judas accepted to betray Jesus. And then finally, the resurrection of the dead. Jesus rises from the dead in Psalm 16, verse 10, which Peter actually quotes at Pentecost in the first sermon recorded in Acts 2. Peter takes that verse and applies it to Jesus. And under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, Peter says, David, when he wrote this psalm, was writing about Jesus, the Jesus that we saw, the Jesus that we knew. Unbelievable detail. And it's not just, as I say, it's not just about the Messiah. But there are other kinds of general prophecies that we find in the Scripture. For example, the destruction of Tyre, prophesied well ahead of the time that actually happened. The fact that Babylon would fall in Isaiah 13 and 14. And one of the more fascinating ones is that a king named Cyrus, C-Y-R-U-S, a king named Cyrus would overthrow Babylon. If you have read your Old Testament history, and you'd really have to get into the detail, but you will recall that Israel, or the nation of Israel, was exiled. The northern half of the nation was captured by the Assyrians, and they were taken off. And the southern half, Judah, hung on for a while, but then the Babylonians came in and conquered them and exiled them off to Babylon. And while the Jews were in exile in Babylon, a Persian king named Cyrus comes in and conquers Babylon. And now Cyrus is the new king in town. And so the Jews are pretty smart. They know their Bible. And they go to King Cyrus, and they say, we'd like to show you something. Our scriptures here that were written about 200 years ago mention you. And he said, really? That'd be pretty cool. Someone came up to me and said, by the way, Glenn, your name, Glenn Petrusky, it was mentioned 200 years ago. I'd say, I'd like to see that. I really would. So they do, and here's what they show him. In Isaiah, they open their Bibles to Isaiah. The last, I have 45, but just back up one verse before that, the last verse of 44. 44:28, and then into 45:1. And here's what they read to King Cyrus. I, the Lord, who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd. He will accomplish all that I please. He will say of Jerusalem, let it be rebuilt, and of the temple, let its foundations be laid. This is what the Lord says to his anointed, to Cyrus, whose right hand I take hold of, to subdue nations before him, and to strip kings of their armor, to open doors before him, so that gates will not be shut. And that's exactly what Cyrus did. Cyrus was an unbelievably powerful warrior who conquered kings. They were falling like dominoes in the Old Testament. And Israel was one of them. Babylon was one of them. He conquered Babylon while the Jews were there. And so he reads this, and he goes, man, I'm impressed. Your God is writing about me 200 years ago, and he's describing me. I'm not one to get God's upset. So go home. And he sent them home. And there's something called the Cyrus cylinder, which is actually his edict that sends the Jews home. that we have found. And again, prophecy really playing an incredible part in God's plan of salvation. But when you see all this unfold, it really tells you that God has to be the source of the Scriptures. There's no other explanation possible for these kinds of things. The overthrow of Nineveh in the book of Nahum was another example. So the prophecies are amazing. Other religious books simply do not have prophecies of such detail, made so far in advance of the prophesied events, which can be corroborated by historical documentation. I don't care what religion you try and check out, you are not going to find this kind of historical accuracy, things that can be documented that actually happened. No other religion. No other religion. I say all the time, there's so many religions in the world. There's just tons of them. And if one of them is true, it ought to be unique to all the others. And Christianity is. The main way it's unique is that you don't have to earn your salvation. In every other belief system, you have to earn it by working for it. But this is another way in the Scripture. The Scriptures of Christianity, the Bible, has so many prophecies that are confirmed historically that no other religion can touch it in terms. So if I'm in the business of trying to choose a religion, I'm going to think real seriously about Christianity. I really would. It's just, there's just too much evidence that supports the final statement. The fulfilled prophecies demonstrate the divine, supernatural origin of the Bible. The Bible comes from God. So I think in answer to the two questions that we posed today, how do we know that the events written by the gospel writers are actually true? Well, we've seen. There is so much compelling evidence to support the truth of what they've said and the accuracy of what they've said. And I think through the fulfilled prophecies we can see that this indeed is a supernatural book. It truly has been breathed out by God. He is the source of our Scriptures. And that's why the Bible is authoritative for us. Remember that. It is the Bible, because of its authority, that should inform the way we believe. And there are too many people, sadly people within the Christian church, who don't really see the Bible in that light. And they say, the culture is doing certain things, and the culture applauds certain things, and so those things are okay. Let the Bible inform your belief. If the Bible says something is wrong, it's wrong, because God says it's wrong. He is the one who determines right and wrong. Let the Bible inform. It is, in that way, it's authoritative. We need to submit our thinking and our beliefs to what the Bible tells us, because it comes from God. Any final questions or thoughts or comments?
You talked about the destruction of Tyre. Well, what's interesting is I always hear the argument, well, there's a new Tyre. So if there's a new Tyre, then Tyre was not destroyed.
Well, the original one was.
I know, but it's hard to explain that to them.
Well, yeah, but that's what it referred to. So that's.
Okay, good answer.
Yeah, that's how I would answer that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? Elmer, could you count everybody here? I would appreciate that.
Is there any book to read? So a big thing that I like when I try to talk to my colleagues is that, and mainly women I work with, that the Bible, I'm not reading that it's written by a bunch of misogynists.
Mm-hmm.
I almost want to laugh because I know. Is there a book, is there anything that references that I can...
The misogyny problem in particular?
Yeah, is there anything I can, just for myself, so that I can have a more educated response to them?
I'm sure there isn't off the top of my... Let me look and let you know. Misogyny is the mistreatment of women. And people accuse Paul of being a misogynist simply because of some of his teachings. However, if you look a little more deeply into his teachings, you find that he is actually radically in support of women, given his culture. Perhaps not given today's standards, but given the time that he lived, forget about it, man. He was radical in terms of his positive view of women. And I would have to look to get some sources on that. That's an excellent question. Steve?
You made a point, I think in history, when we talk to people, they at times the historical validity of the Bible, but so much of the stuff that we believe doesn't even have the same historical substance. When you start talking about Julius Caesar, you start talking about these things, they don't even, they're just going by things that they've been taught in school.
Yes.
But it doesn't necessarily, if you look back and try to find a historical reference and documents, you can't even find a lot of those things.
That's true. It is true. So again, it just speaks to how well documented we have the scriptures that God in His sovereignty has provided to us. Very, very true. Alrighty, well let me pray and then we'll go in. I don't want to, I'll just be late for church. Lord, thank you for your love and your kindness and your grace towards us, that you have provided us with these scriptures, that you cared enough about us to reveal your Son in prophecy and then to fulfill that prophecy, Lord, with truth. I just thank you for your word. I thank you that you have given it to us, and I pray that your Spirit would help us to submit to it, and that we would let the Bible inform our beliefs and use it as we grow and grow closer to you in knowledge and in relationship. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen.